Hey everybody. Hello, how are you doing? Good. I just want to begin this morning and just to say thank you for your response that we're collecting both here and in our Leland location. And we are so grateful for the response that you guys have brought. Someone came to me after the first service and they're like, Mike, this church has meant so much to us. And I had to remind them that part of the reason that this church means so much to them is because of their own contribution to it, that all of you here, right, you bring something to who we are becoming that allows God to use it in that way. And, when we get to do stuff like this together, it's just sort of tangible in that. And part of what, I want to just to say is, when we were talking about this, we want to be helpful. We know the devastation in the western part of the state, and we want to be helpful. We want to be responsive to what is going on. This is also, unique, or at least distinct from what we experienced, 6 years ago here. The loss of life in this area is going to be significant. It is significant, and so this is a serious thing that we're entering into. It's a sacred thing that we get to enter into, and so we want to be really mindful of that. And part of when this first happened, we immediately sent some money to our partners who were there. And then we got connected with some friends who are part of our church from Megacore. And I just want to say thank you to Ross and Ryan and Megacore for what they've done this week, sending trucks. And yeah, y'all can say thank you. And they've sent trucks and they're fueling helicopters and delivering medical supplies. A lot of really cool things that are happening. And so we've been over there just back and forth and invited us to collect today to be able to send over, and they'll load trucks from Megacourt and send them out. And so we're just really grateful to be able to participate with what you guys are doing. I don't know if Ryan and Ross are in here, but with what you guys are doing. And it's an honor to do that. Also, what we also know is just from seeing the devastation, the effects are gonna be long-term. The recovery is gonna be a long-term approach. And so part of what we're gonna be doing is tomorrow night we're going to be hosting a hurricane response panel. We'll be talking to some folks with disaster relief experience, as well as some of the things that we've done, and really start to talk about our long-term approach to where we can find to be consistently helpful over the course of the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months in particular areas over there. So we're working all that tonight, right now. We've got, contacts there and talking, and we'll let you guys know more about that tomorrow night. So we'll be having that. We'll also spend some time praying. All the other information on our response is found on our website at portcity.church/Helene, and we can get all that there. So I just want to say thank you. It's an honor for us to be able to serve in that way, and we are certainly grateful for your participation in that. Today we're going to just take a hard turn. We're going to be continuing a series that Carson and Jeff started over the last couple of weeks called Everyday Encounters. And I am so thankful for Carson and Jeff over the last couple weeks. Did y'all enjoy hearing from both of them? They're good. That's just good. People come up to me and they're like, Mike, you better watch out. I'm like, no, that's called relief right there, man. That means I can get out. I'm just kidding. I'm not going anywhere. Not yet anyway. But I love this because part of what I love is that I do believe it's important for us to hear what God is saying to our church, and that comes from other mouths other than mine. It comes from it's our voice. And I'm really grateful for Carson and Jeff for their influence in my life personally, in our leadership, and certainly in our congregation. And what I appreciate most about everybody who stands up here is the seriousness with which they take this. This is not about building a platform or leveraging influence. This is about bringing something to bear on our congregation to say, Lord, what do you want us to learn together? And it's a significant and it's a serious thing for people to entrust us, for you to entrust us with your time. And so we work to take that very seriously, and I'm really grateful for the humility and the seriousness with which they take that, and just hope that continues to translate out. Today, our Carson began talking about our everyday encounters at work and talked about the importance of faith. Jeff, challenged our assumptions, as he always does. He challenged our assumptions about what it looks like to have an encounter with God and what it means to have an encounter with God, but the point of it is. And then my task today is to talk about encountering God in the noise. And by noise, I hope you mean, I don't just mean that things are loud. I mean, the noise is like the constant distraction that seems to be always around us, sort of threatening to derail us from whatever it is we're trying to do. It always feels like that something's on the verge of getting done and then it's undermined by all the chaos around us. Does it feel like that to y'all sometimes? It's like, it always just feels like it's there. And so sometimes it's hard to find or hear what God is doing. And that's what I want for us to talk about. We're looking at an Old Testament prophet named Elijah. And some of you may be familiar with this passage. We'll look at it in 1 Kings chapter 19. There are so many things that in just the normal way in which we live that demand our attention, that pull us and shape us and form us. They shape the way in which we see the world, and we don't necessarily even realize it because we're just so accustomed to what it is that we see and feel all of the time. And so what I want to challenge us in today is to say that encountering Christ is not some luxury that we're afforded. It's not something we go, oh, now I can connect with God, and now I can connect with the church, and now I can connect with other people. This is a really nice addition to my life. But rather that encountering Christ is essential for your life. Like you have to believe that. I encourage you to believe that. Like for me, I've learned, again, I'm gonna talk about this in just a minute, but I've learned that getting up and spending time with the Lord, doing my quiet time, whatever you might call it today, a personal devotion time, is incredibly critical to my life. People will ask me, I said, the way I say it is I do my quiet time as though my life depends upon it, because I actually believe that it does. And I want you to take that kind of seriousness with what I'm gonna talk about this morning. I want us to believe that this is essential for how we're to live, and be willing to do whatever it takes to find ways to live in responsiveness to Him, to discern His voice, to bear His image faithfully, and to bear witness to His work and His ways right in the middle of the noisiness and the chaos of our world. That's what I want for us. Jeff said last week that it will look different for everyone, and it will. But I will tell you, it is imperative for everyone. There's nobody that I've met that's an exception to learning how to spend time with God, to be in His presence, to encounter Him. And I would say daily, if you're gonna learn how to sense His presence throughout the course of your life, it's gonna be because you have a point in time where you make a point to do that frequently or regularly or rhythmically. Don't walk out of here today and go, I'm gonna do this 7 days a week for the next 2 years, because you ain't gonna do it. You can go out here and say, I'm gonna do this 3 days this week, and then do it and celebrate it. And then do it 3 days next week, and then celebrate it and do it. And then do it 4 days. And then, I always joke, because I've been walking with the Lord, trying to learn how to do this since I was a teenager. I was 14 or 15 years old when I first began to keep a journal and write my prayers and read the Bible, and it was fits and starts for a long time. And I often tell people, it's become a habit. To still myself before God has become a habit. And people say that it takes 28 days to establish a habit. Well, this habit only took me 28 years. So if you're not there yet, it's okay. But you have to arrange your life in order to do this. There's just no shortcut in this. And the reason this is so important, and it's especially important in this day and age, I don't critique the church because we're a part of it. I try not to do that. But what I do have is a concern for what I see happening in a lot of places is the lack of discernment that people have to see and sense and hear what God is saying. And what I fundamentally believe, I want you to hear me correctly, I do not believe that I have that, but it's something that we have to have. We do this together. This is what the language of the scripture is always collective, it's always corporate. It's the scriptures, it's the community of people where God indwells. And it is out of that place that we discern and act and move to bear witness and to bear His image. That's how this is supposed to work. And so I want to be really mindful of how we posture ourselves to do that, because we must acknowledge that we all have a tendency to project onto God what we would do if we were Him. We all know how we would solve certain problems if we were God. If we had unlimited power, we would do this or that. And we often project that onto Him. But to encounter Him and to start with a place as a really humble posture, a responsive posture, say, Lord, whatever you want to do, I will do. I will avail myself to whatever you want. It's a willingness to respond to what we've been entrusted to. And that is to bear His image and to bear witness. You have been entrusted with His image. You've been entrusted with the vocation of representing Him as His in the world in which you live, in the noise in which we live. And this is a significant thing. And it's interesting because the psalmist often will begin their prayers like this. Often, there's several places, I guess, is a stretch. There's several places where you see this. And you see things like, open my eyes that I might behold the wonders that are your word. And it's a prayer, it's a posture. Say, God, could you help me see something that I believe is true, but doesn't always seem to be true or feel true? Can you help me to see that? Other places it says to incline my heart to your understanding, or incline my heart to your testimonies, or incline my heart to your story, to what you're doing. Lord, can you tip me in that direction? Right, I talked to our pastoral staff this past week. We talked about there's these two storylines that run parallel. One is the story of the world, and it's like bigger, faster, stronger, more, protect yourself, don't trust anyone. And then there's the kingdom storyline that is self-sacrifice, others-oriented love. It's transcendent. And which one do you think pulls you and I the hardest? I work in the church, for crying out loud. And guess what pulls the hardest? Bigger, faster, more. It always pulls us. Right, we've got to encounter Christ in some way that reorients us to this. And Carson, in his first message, starting this series, he used this quote from Dallas Willard. We're going to continue to build on it for the next couple of weeks. This is from the book Renovation of the Heart. Dallas Willard, one of my heroes. He says, the first and most basic thing we can do and must do is to keep God before our minds. This is the fundamental secret of caring for our souls. Right? As your walk goes, so goes your sort of inner self. It's the first and most basic thing to care for the person that you are becoming. And he says our part in practicing the presence of God is to direct and redirect, and in my case, and redirect and redirect and redirect and redirect and redirect our minds constantly to him. In the early time of our, quote, practicing, we may well be challenged by our burdensome habits of dwelling on things less than God. Leave it to old Dallas to come up with some little boom. These burdensome habits of being distracted by everything else all the time. Burdensome habits. I want you to think about this. What is your mind most easily dwell on? What is before your minds most easily in the world in which we live? Is it peace and unity and joy? Right? No. It's like fear. And like, I gotta take because if I don't, someone else is gonna get it. It's scarcity. It's cynicism. It's futility. Has anybody ever thought you've done all this work and it didn't really matter? You should have just done what you were gonna do anyway. You ever felt like that? Especially when you do things for God. It's like, I've been faithful to you. This didn't turn out like I wanted. I'll just take care of me and myself. I mean, that's the thing. I'll just take care of me and my little tribe and let everybody else do what they want to do. And our view is often clouded by these things. Or we're constantly concerned that if we feel anxious or concerned, if we feel a depth of concern for the world, or we feel sad about things, that we're just gonna go right over the cliff of anxiety and depression, and then our lives are gonna be over anyway. And people live on this sort of precipice, especially a younger generation, right? They're talking about this with, the anxious generation. It's what's been tagged as because of phones and a lot of other things by Jonathan Haidt. There's a lot of research on this. But it's this sense of fear that this is gonna happen to me. It's like, how can we reorient ourselves to something that God has actually called us to do? Jesus actually, he gives us all this instruction in John 14, 15. He's like, remain in me, it's be in my presence. And then at the very end of this, he says, because in this world you will have trouble. That is the promise that Jesus gives us. In this world, it's going to be chaos. In this world, the wheels are gonna wobble and they're likely to come off. In this world you have trouble, but what does he invite us to do? Take heart. Something has to happen here, take heart, because he's overcome the world. So how do we learn to live in this? Keeping God before your mind. This is how we begin to combat these burdensome thoughts. So just an aside, this is one reason I love my one word and why I commend it and continue to believe in it and work towards it, because it is, a lot of people believe that they don't have any say over what they see. And you might not have a say over what you see, but you do have a say over how you see. And my one word puts a lens in front of you and says, I'm going to choose how I see what is happening in the world and God's work in it and God's work in my life. My word this year is cologne. It's not like the spray good cologne. It's K-A-L-O-N. It's the Greek word for beauty, and it's extravagant beauty, sacrificial beauty. And so I'm trying to learn to look at the world through this lens, through everything that happens. How do I see some extravagance of what God is doing in the world? And it's challenging, but it frames the way we see the world. So Elijah and this encounter with God, this in the noise. So what's interesting about Elijah, so it's in the book of Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings is how it's divided in your Bibles. If you ever read it, it's actually a really interesting, it is chaotic. It's like, this king was terrible, and this king was worse, and then they divided into two. I mean, it's David and Solomon in the beginning, and the very opening thing is after this, they start to kind of realize that Solomon's gonna succeed David as king, and they conspire together just to ensure that God's people, right, to ensure that God's work gets done, they conspire together to assassinate all these other people who threaten that. Like we're gonna do God's work, we're gonna kill these people to get it done. You realize that's how a lot of things have happened in our world. A lot of the theological points of views that have remained up to this day is because all the people who disagree with them were all killed or beheaded or called heretics and burned centuries ago. Like this is how it works. And so this started back in the Old Testament, so they're doing this. And then they get a succession of kings. And 1st and 2nd Kings kind of outline this list of kings. And the kingdom is eventually divided under Solomon into two kings. You have the kingdom to the north, which is known as Israel, and its capital is Samaria. The kingdom to the south is Judah, and its capital is Jerusalem. And so then it just says there were kings in the north and kings in the south. There were 20 kings in the north, and they were all bad kings. And there were roughly 20 kings in the south, and 8 of them were good kings, and the rest were bad kings. So the track record's not so good. This rule of man drove the people of God into the ditch, so to speak. And we meet the prophets, and the prophets come to bear to mainly speak to these kings and warn them against idolatry, against covenant unfaithfulness, to warn them against these things, to say, you're not doing what God is asking you to do. You're not living in the way that God has intended for you to live. And it's these warnings. These are the prophets, and this is what happens in them. And so Elijah is one of them. He goes to a king named Ahab. And Ahab is the king of Israel, the southern kingdom. And this is how Ahab is described. Ahab made an Asherah pole, which is an altar. But he also made, he's in the northern kingdom. He made an Asherah pole, and he did more to arouse the anger of God than did all the kings before. So he had ticked God off. So God promises through Elijah drought, there's no water, and this goes on, and then Elijah shows up to sort of end the drought. And he does this in the most dramatic of ways. He goes to see King Ahab. He's going to challenge you to a duel of gods. This is fascinating. This is in 1 Kings chapter 18. And so he says, I want you to get together your 450 prophets of Baal, and I want you to get together 400 prophets from Asherah. And so there's 850 prophets up on this mountain, Mount Carmel. And he's like, you guys build an altar, and then you call down fire from heaven, from your gods, and then he'll lap it up, and I'll do the same thing. We'll see which God responds. That's the game that's about to be played. So they get up there, they do this. So this goes on, and they build this altar, and they're calling out to God. They're doing these dances. It says they're cutting themselves before God. Baal, Asherah, bring down fire, and nothing happens. And all the while, Elijah's over there going, maybe he's asleep, right? Maybe he's just talking trash to them. This is like in the Bible. He's just talking trash to them. And you can sort of feel Elijah's like swag kind of growing, right? And after they're done, he's like, all right, I'll tell you what, to make this fair, we're gonna douse my altar in tons of water. So he just has all this water poured over it. He's just rubbing it in. Then he calls on God, and God comes down and laps at the fire, boom, and he kills all these prophets. And it's like a spectacular thing. Now, what do you think that Elijah felt or thought would happen after this tremendous success? This tremendous thing. God had honored his efforts. What did he think would happen? That all the people would now turn and respond the way they were supposed to. That things would work out the way they were supposed to. I mean, this is what Elijah had in mind. When this happens, God's gonna show himself, and then everybody's gonna return to him, and nobody did. And now he's ticked. And not only is he ticked, but now Jezebel is gonna have him killed like she's killed all these other prophets. And so Elijah runs. He runs away up into the desert. And this is where we find Elijah. And he's in the desert. He's frustrated. He's overwhelmed. And you know what he says? I want to die. And I don't think this is hyperbole. I think this is what happens to human beings when there's this sort of implosion of disappointment. And we thought we did this, and now we realize that maybe it wasn't enough. Or all the other emotions that we feel. It's like, I just want to die. I just want to end this. I want to be done with this. And some of you have probably felt that in here. And it's a significant thing for human beings to feel so much despair and so much disappointment. But this is a reality. And this is given to us in this story of Elijah. And God meets him. And God affirms a couple of things in Elijah's life. One is he says, you're exhausted. And he gives him food. He gives him food. And then he says to Elijah, this journey is too much for you. You need to eat. You need some strength. I think for a lot of us, like it's okay at some point in time to recognize the challenges that we face feel overwhelming. The condition of the things we have to deal with sometimes feel overwhelming. We don't have all the right answers or know the right way forward. And sometimes what you need to hear God say is, yes, this journey is too difficult for you. Let me enter into this in some ways that perhaps you need. I can tell you firsthand, I felt this at many, many, many points throughout my life. If anything that kind of narrates the story of Mike's life in this church, it is I have always known that I was in over my head. Like that's been the condition of my life most of my adult life. And it serves you well in one side. It is very difficult in other ways, right? Because you just never feel like you're on top of things. And what you have to do is you have to learn how to trust and respond and listen and all the things that go along with that. And so as this is happening, Elijah is fed, and then it says this, he walks 40 days and 40 nights through the desert to Mount Horeb, or also known as Mount Sinai. And if you know the Bible, you begin to I think I've heard that before. 40 days through the wilderness, and then up into a mountain called Sinai. This sounds like something like a guy named Moses. Remember this? And this is how the Bible is written. It's written in these patterns. Elijah shows up on the mountain of God, and he's there. And this is where we find the story. He picks up in chapter 19, starting in verse 9. He went to a cave and he spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him and says, what are you doing here, Elijah? What is it? Why are you here? This is an important question for us to ask and to answer. Like when you're frustrated, when you're in despair, when you're overwhelmed, and you hear God say to you, why are you where you are? It's important to give an answer to that question. And Elijah gives a very honest answer. He's basically like, it's your fault. I've been zealous for you, and it hasn't worked out the way I thought it would, right? He says, I've been zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and your prophets have been put to death by the sword, and I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. That's why I'm here. That's a good reason, isn't it? And so he's asking this question. And the Lord said, I want you to go out, and I want you to stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now I can assure you, Elijah is a prophet. He knew the Torah. He knew the stories of Moses, and he would have surely known the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 33. Moses is also on the mountain, and he's frustrated with God. A lot of scholars kind of believe or imagine this is the exact same cave where Moses was. And so Moses is mad because God has asked him, has promised them to go into the promised land, and they seem to be wandering around the desert, and he can't figure out like what's gonna happen. He's like, God, this didn't turn out like I thought. And God says, okay, Moses, I'll send you into the promised land, but I'm not going with you. And Moses is like, okay, if you don't go with us, I don't know that we wanna go. And it's this reckoning moment of Moses to realize that sometimes God's presence in the desert is far more important than being without it in the promised land. And it's this shaking of Moses. And then he says, God, can you show me your glory? And God says, I will. And here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna take you and I want you to hide in the cave, in the cleft of the rock. I'm gonna cover you with my hand and I'm gonna pass by. Because if you see me face to face, you'll die. So I'm gonna pass by, and as I get by you, I'm gonna remove my hand and you can just see me passing by. I'll show you my glory. And so Elijah probably has this in his mind when God says to him, I'm gonna show you My presence is gonna pass by. So then here's what unfolds. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But what does it say? The Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not there in the earthquake either. And after the earthquake came a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. What was Elijah expecting? He knew Moses. What happened when God showed up on Mount Sinai? It was fire and thunder and earthquakes. Elijah has to be looking for things that God had done before and say, but every time this happened, he said, he's not there. He's not there either. He's not there. And then it says this, that after this fire came what's the word? Gentle whisper. Some of you have probably heard this as the still small voice. The literal translation would be thin silence. Elijah heard a thin silence. And sometimes what a lot of scholars believe is that thin silence is not just an isolated thing, but it's something that happens on the heels of these other sort of extraordinary things. So like sometimes when you're in church or you're in worship and you're like, God, I feel you and you're so near, it's what happens in those quiet moments after maybe a service, like maybe this afternoon, or maybe tomorrow morning when everything's quiet, you're kind of entering, you had this day where you felt like God, you feel this way. There's a thin silence. And when Elijah heard it, what does he do? He pulls his cloak and he covers his face because he knows that you cannot look at God face to face and live. And the voice said to him, what are you doing here? And Elijah applies very quickly again. I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword, and I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me. I wonder if as he's talking about this, he starts to hear himself and he slows down and he starts to reconsider. Maybe I'm here for another reason. I've just encountered God and this story that I've got in my head about him not doing what I wanted him to do, maybe it needs to die here. And so here he is. And this is not like, it's the thing about the Bible, it's from one sentence to the next. We don't know what Isaiah did. I try to imagine as God meets him, that Elijah comes out with his cloak around his head because he knows God's passing by. He heard this gentle, this space where he feels like he's enveloped by God's presence that's quiet and still. And maybe God covers him with his hand and with his other hand, if God had hands, you know what I mean? And he removes the covering and said, hey, you've tried to cover yourself. Don't you worry, Elijah, I got you. And he covers him and then he passes by in the same way he did with Moses. Maybe there's this really beautiful, tender moment that Elijah experiences. And he recognizes that his story that he's kind of bought into needs to change. And then God says to him, I want you to go back the way that you came. What? This is where they're trying to kill me. Go to the desert of Damascus, and when you get there, anoint Hazael king of over Aram, and then also anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, from Abel Mahaloah, to succeed you as the prophet. And that's that. So what do we do with this? Here's what I want for us to get in the next 6 minutes and 22 seconds. When Elijah covers his face, right, God sends him back. And he says, I want you to go back to the place that I've called you, for I have a future that I am bringing, and you have a responsibility in it. It's that line. I'm sending you back because I have a future that I intend, and you have a responsibility in it. An encounter with God is always a collision. It's always this sort of thing that happens. And encounters are sometimes intentional when you put yourself before God, and sometimes God just shows up in ways that are undeniable. And you're not likely to miss an encounter, but we are likely to miss the point of an encounter. Because they're always formative, but there's always a tension in an encounter. What God is trying to do when he meets you and you encounter him is he's shaping you into his image. What we are often trying to do with God in an encounter is to conform him to ours and get him to do what we want to do. Have you ever noticed that? There's a tension there. And encounters are designed, that's why there needs to be this thin silence, this place where we feel like we're enveloped in his presence. It's enveloped. I want to put this on the screen because I want you to see this. To encounter God, this is what I mean. To encounter God is to see him in a way that orients us to him, and therein our way to his, not the other way around. That when we encounter God, we are reorienting our way to his. This reorientation reminds us that our allegiance is to him and to his kingdom, and it is often, and often it sets his way in contrast with whatever else competes for our affections. I have learned that I don't always automatically want what God wants. I have to sit and to sort with him. So here are kind of three takeaways that I feel like we get from this particular passage. And again, we got to get out of here in a little bit. Number one is we cannot get too, sometimes I can't believe I wrote this down. We cannot get too caught up in the outcomes. What Elijah thought would happen didn't. I can tell you this is hard for me for a lot of reasons. One is I am obsessed with effectiveness. Like I do not want to be involved in things that are not effective. We work really hard to do all those kinds of things. And I have learned that a lot of times the things that I do or try or attempt often don't turn out like I thought that they would. And sometimes the things that I thought were like the most, God, I did this, and he did not even do remotely what I thought he would do with it. And you feel the sense of disappointment. And what you learn out of Elijah and what I've learned in my own life is that the point of God's call on your life, of his invitation in your life and in my life, is not to be effective, it's to be faithful. God is asking you to be faithful, to trust him with whatever it is he has asked you to do. The outcomes, how things turn out, how successful things are not necessarily the right markers for how God-honoring something is. It's kind of my beef with a lot of what's happening in the church, that people think that because there's a lot of people there, that must immediately mean, and it doesn't. It doesn't. I've been in this a long time. To be honest, it's actually not that difficult to get a lot of people to come to something. What's hard is getting people together to be committed to bearing God's image and bearing his witness in the world in a way that honestly reflects him. That's what's hard. But that's what our call is. That's what our role is. And that brings me to the second thing, that oftentimes we think that if we walk with God long enough, he's going to make our lives easier. That's what I assumed. I thought, man, I've been doing this for 25 years. 25 years, this should get easier. What we learn from this is that God's responsibility, the responsibility he gives you, it's hard. It's hard. I remember when we started Port City Church, I thought my goal was if we can get through the first 3 years and I'm not dead, that'll be a success. It was a low bar. I didn't care about attendance. I didn't care. I was like, if I'm alive, if I have a pulse, I'll be excited. And we were. And then we went from year 3 to year 5 to and Richie Marshall, our executive pastor, we've been saying since 2012, if we can just get through 2012, and then the next, if we can just get it, it just gets more and more. You know, honestly, we got to a place in 2019, we're like, man, we worked so hard. We were at a place in coming into 2020, we were like, we have finally got where we need to be. 2020, you know what happens. The whole world fell apart. And then it got, even harder. And I tell you that not to go, don't feel bad. That's not what this is about. It's just to recognize that when God gives you responsibility, when he entrusts us with things that matter to him to bring redemption and reconciliation to things, right? It's not about being healthy, wealthy, and wise. It's about giving our lives to the things that matter to God. And that's the third thing, that God is working for a future and not merely a solution. I need to take a few minutes here because this is really important. A lot of people, Jeremiah 29:11 is your go-to verse. It's the verse for every graduation speech and every graduation journal. Because it says, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a what? A future. And it seems that God has promised me as an individual hope and a future. And this future is guaranteed. And it brings comfort to me because it means that I will probably be comfortable. And that's not at all what this verse means. It was not written to an individual. It is not a personal promise to you. It is a promise to his people. And the fulfillment of that promise is the future for which you and I and every generation has been created for, and that which we long for. The future is not about your individual success or your individual impact, or about my individual success or my individual impact. It is about the return of shalom. It is about redemption and reconciliation, period. It is the way in which human beings will be rightly related to God, to each other, to ourselves, to each other, and to the world. That is the promised future that God is bringing in. Our lives are a part of that promise, but they are not objects of it. We have to get this, or you will use God or demand of God. He is using our lives. This is why it requires us to trust. The one thing that I have learned is that the longer I walk with the Lord, you get to these places where you find God to be so faithful. And I'm like, I want to build like a compound here and just live here. And it turns out that this place where I ended up is just a door to something more. Every time I keep, I'll talk about this more on the 25th anniversary, but I thought something was wrong with me, because it's not that I feel like I'm very content, but there's always something, because when you get to a place where you find God to be faithful, he opens up something for us to have more faith. It never, ever stops. That's why it's hard. That's why it requires something of us, and it requires us to get alone and to get still before God. His promise to you for a future is not personal, but his promise to you of his presence is. And this is where hearing the still small voice is so critical. It's so critical. This place is intimate and it is personal. I can assure you, I have ADD with the best of them. To be still is not easy. I can show you my journals even 2 weeks ago where I have written out entire passages in the Bible in my journal by hand. All of Ephesians 1. What I do is when I cannot get my mind and my heart to settle down, I open up my Bible, open up my journal, I begin to write the passage that I'm reading. I write it out because I am convinced that I have got to get still before God. I have to move into this thin space where my life is sort of enveloped in his for just a moment. I have to do this frequently, daily for me, frequently, rhythmically. There's a kind of confidence that comes from his provision. When I can sit down and say, God, you've always provided, you're faithful to provide, I can trust your provision. All the worry begins to dissipate of all the things that are budgets and this and all the other things that we deal with. There's a kind of peace that comes in his presence. That somehow all the things that are happening in the world that are pulling at me and pulling at us, they kind of dissipate in this place where I find that God and his peace is so real and it's so pervasive. There's a kind of contentment in his promise that all of a sudden I don't have to get my way. Have you ever said that out loud to someone? Just say, I don't have to get my way. That's like a shocking statement to most people because we don't live like that. I don't have to get my way. My story does not have to be central. There's a renewed understanding and a renewed vision of God's promise that transcends my own experience and in fact my own life. Do you know what Isaiah did? What Elijah did in this passage? He anointed his successor. He anointed, said, this person is going to continue what I was doing when I'm not doing it anymore. That's a sobering thing for me to think, but someone is going to be doing this one day that's not going to be me. And that's the future I've got to work for. I'm not working for mine, I'm working for that future. We've got to have a vision for this, that it transcends your life and my life. It's generations. And if you're going to learn how to encounter him and discern and sense him, on a regular basis, you're going to have to learn to do it on an intentional basis. And this is where I want to end. You've got to make time to do it. I would say, honestly, whatever you have to do, I would do it. It is worth it. It is when you are overwhelmed or done with things that you need this more desperately. Because his call comes with responsibility, and that is hard. But his promise is beyond our personal comfort, and this is what fuels us to give our lives away. And so here's my question. When you're overwhelmed, or you're struggling, or you're challenged, or you're at the end of your rope, or you're ready to give up, here's what I want to ask you. What might one more step of faith look like for you? The one thing that I'm convinced of for my life is I do not want to get to the end of it and say, stop just a little bit short. I'd rather lose everything than stop short. So what might one more step look like for you? And it's not a big thing. One of the things that I've learned in these sort of crucible moments where I encounter Christ and there's this still thin silence with him, especially when I'm overwhelmed. I have a sign, a rock that sits out on my back porch. It's a little rock stone with a painted verse. It's from Psalm 62. It says, "When my heart is overwhelmed within me, lead me to the rock that is higher than I." And it's just this place where I can stand and kind of find this thin silence. I would always hear God say, "God, I don't know what to do about this, and I don't know what to do about that, and I don't know about this, and I can't figure this out." And it's happened a lot. He just says, you just need to be faithful in this moment. Your only task is not to solve, to fix, to do, it's just to be faithful in this moment. I hear him remind me that his grace is sufficient for me. I hear him remind me that his strength is perfected in my weakness. My task is to trust him, and this still small voice reminds me that it's always about these simple little steps. What might one more step of faith look like for you? Father, thank you for your faithfulness to us. And my prayer for our congregation is that we would make a space this week to be still before you. And Father, what I ask of you is that you would meet us there in a thin silence to call and affirm and remind and challenge and shape. Would you expose us where we demand from you and lead us to repentance? Would you encourage us where we're wearied? Would you give us courage where we're afraid? And Father, that this future that you've promised, would you use our lives to bring about the redemption and the reconciliation of all things? What a beautiful picture of how you long to be in our lives. Would you do that? I lift all this to you in the name of your Son, Jesus, who is our King. Amen.